Thank you very much, Cheatham, for that very generous and kind introduction. And for some reason, oh, there we go. Okay. Great. So, and thanks also really for an opportunity to revisit that 2015 monograph that you mentioned. 7 years have passed, which is sort of astonishing to me. 7 years since I published that book, and quite a bit has happened, certainly in my own research. Cheatham had mentioned that I'm co-directing with Michele Massa the Konya Regional Archaeological Survey project, so I'll be weaving in some of the preliminary results from that project into this discussion. But more broadly, I'm beginning to think a little differently about the early Bronze Age. I think mostly because I'm actually looking forward chronologically and thinking more about the late Bronze Age and about Hittites and even Hittitology more generally in relation to the early Bronze Age. And certainly I'll be, in this talk, I'll be devoting more space to that problem than I did in the book. So this is the big question, of course, for this talk, and what is this relationship really? I think most specialists would agree that there is some relationship between what happens in Central and Western Anatolia in the early Bronze Age and what happens in the late Bronze Age. But how do we characterize that relationship? How do we describe the relationship? And of course, more importantly, how do we understand that relationship? I'm not claiming to have any final or definitive answers to this problem, but I want to revisit some aspects of the early Bronze Age that I explored in my book to really come at this question more directly, certainly more directly than I did in the book. What is indeed this relationship? And of course, I'm not the only one thinking this. This has been a driving sort of paradigm in the archaeology of Turkey for a century. So it's a vast problem, both chronologically and spatially. So there's a lot of ground to cover in this presentation. Spatially, the area is mostly defined by this map on the left, and this is how I sort of in my book represented kind of a pure polity interaction zone. So it's using this sort of John Cherry terminology, where all of a sudden you see this unprecedented uniformity is not the right word, but similarities in material culture and styles and tastes and various assemblages, architecturally, etc., over this vast region. So this is the area that I want to focus on, is the primary focus of my book. But of course, much of this area is also very relevant to the late Bronze Age in terms of an interaction zone. And we'll come back to that problem in a few slides. But arguably the bigger problem is this vast temporal or gap or space between the developments that I address in my book, which is from the chronological scale on the right. It is that kind of towards city-state formation phenomenon at the latter half of the third millennium, and indeed the archaeology of the late Bronze Age, Hittite state and empire a millennium later. So, so vast spatial and chronological frameworks here to address this problem. And again, I'm not claiming to have all the answers, certainly. But what I'm hoping to do is to show you how I may be thinking about this relationship going forward, or how I would approach this relationship going forward. Sorry, and there's just including the Hittite state, the land of Hatti, the cities of the land of Hatti, just to remind everyone of that at least spatial relationship between the two. So broadly, I think the most of the scholarship on this issue can be described as proto-historic, and indeed I would even describe my approach to this problem as proto-historic, because in the background, of course, there was always the linguistic and textual evidence with which to frame these questions. And so I guess I would separate it into two different approaches, proto-historic approaches, where languages and texts feature in the kinds of questions we're asking of early Bronze Age material. And so we're starting here with what is ultimately, I would describe as a linguistic approach. Now, Alajahuyuk, of course, is probably the most emblematic site for the early Bronze Age in Anatolia, and certainly the standards are arguably the most emblematic objects from this time period. But it is emblematic really of two really contrasting proto-histories. One, of course, that sees Alajahuyuk as a kind of predecessor to the Hittites, a kind of almost an ancestral relationship to the late Bronze Age Hittite state and empire. And here, if we turn to Aegean prehistory, for example, there'd be a very close analogy with the relationship between the shaft graves and Mycenae, the later palace of Mycenae, right? So here is a kind of almost an ancestral relationship on the one hand. On the other hand, there is quite a different proto-history, which is more based in kind of historical linguistic considerations. Of course, now we're talking about that Hattic substrate, the non-Indo-European Hattic substrate in Hittite texts, which shows, I think, demonstrates convincingly that there were people who lived in this region prior to, let's say, certainly about the second millennium, that did not speak Hittite or any Indo-European language for that matter. And in this sort of linguistic approach to this particular proto-history, Alajahuyuk is emerging as maybe emblematic of the Hattic people, the people who inhabited the land of Hatti before the Hittites. Right. So in this scenario, Alajahuyuk is here is the inhabitants of the land of Hatti before the emergence of the Hittite state. A similar linguistic approach, which again, more language-based than text-based, is the question of Indo-Europeans, Indo-European speakers, Luvian speakers, of course, the Nesite or Hittite speakers, etc. And here, historical linguists are mostly agreed that there was probably a single language in the third millennium that was spoken across much of the region of central and western Anatolia. And in the third millennium, these languages began to diverge into what is the late Bronze Age, Palaic, Luvian, and Nesite or Hittite. And so on the left, we're showing this, this interaction zone, this pure polity interaction zone from the from the early Bronze Age, where we're taking some leaps of faith here, right? But within this interaction zone of the third millennium, we can maybe conceive of one language potentially that was spoken across this region, and began to fragment into these different language areas after, well, maybe even during the third millennium, but certainly by the second millennium. And this relates very closely, of course, to if we start using these ethnonyms of Luvians or Hittites. These are language designations, certainly, and there is probably some correspondence here between these different Indo-European languages that are closely related, but are certainly differentiated by the second millennium. And of course, we can also go back to the previous slide of the non-Indo-European Hattic language. So again, there's a presumption or an assumption that maybe the archaeology of the early Bronze Age could map on in some way to this historical linguistic prehistory, if you want to call it that, of these varied Indo-European languages. Okay, so I'm going to move from the sort of language approaches to more text-based approaches. And of all the proto histories I'm reviewing here, this is probably the most recent, where we have on the left, the slide and the middle slide, representations of late Bronze Age dynamics. So on the one hand, you have what is a linguistic map, the Luvian arc. Everything to the south and the west of the Luvian arc is believed to have been inhabited by Luvian speakers, certainly by the late Bronze Age. And closely related to that is a more kind of historical political map. Of course, David Hawkins' well-known representation of the political geography of the late Bronze Age. And if we move over one more, this is a more recent work by my colleague Denise Sara, who had similarly mapped on what appears to be, she has several maps of the early Bronze Age, but there is these very sort of fragmented culture areas based mostly on pottery, which she, to some extent, maps onto what is also a very fragmented political geography of the late Bronze Age on the map in the middle. That there is some correspondence between these culture areas, of course, ultimately, I would say, defined by the really complex geography of Western Anatolia, and the political geography of the late Bronze Age. So again, another correspondence here that is more an historical correspondence based on late Bronze Age political geography, text-based correspondence, rather than a linguistic one. But the dominant, I would say, proto-history, and certainly the proto-history that is most, what the literature is most prolific now, certainly in the past 2 decades, much of this, of course, due to excavations at Kotepe and the sort of refocus at Kotepe onto the early Bronze Age levels. But work all over Central and Western Anatolia is just confirming, excavation-based work, mostly confirming what is indisputably a very real relationship between Central and Western Anatolia and the region of Upper Mesopotamia, or sort of northern Iraq, northern Syria. That this is real. The evidence keeps on sort of piling up, in a sense, and providing more and more sort of nuance on what this relationship is all about. So there are various, interpretations of this relationship. There are those who would suggest even that there were perhaps merchants from Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria, northern Iraq, visiting early Bronze Age citadels in Central Anatolia. Certainly, this arguments have been based on cylinder seals, seal impressions, like massive deposit of sealing impressions from Kotepe, for example. I take a more cautious view, sort of along the lines of the pot stone equal people argument, that just because you have the cylinder seal doesn't mean that you have the someone associated with that cylinder seal from the same origin point of the cylinder seal, etc. But nevertheless, there is very real and very meaningful communication happening between these two regions. And the closely related proto-history is, of course, this taking it in a way one step further and really trying to understand what the relationship is between Mesopotamia and Anatolia in the early Bronze Age. And here again, some specialists look at these sorts of historical literary traditions, like the King of Battle, for example, Akkadian King of Battle, where famously Sargon sends an army into Central Anatolia to free captive merchants. There are different ways to read that. Some read it more literally, that this is actually a almost a valid historical account of interactions between Mesopotamia and Anatolia in the early Bronze Age, of course, the Akkadian period, latter half of the 3rd millennium. Whereas I also here take a slightly more cautious approach, where I don't necessarily see merchants from this region inhabiting or otherwise visiting these cities or citadels. And I certainly don't see any compelling evidence for some kind of Akkadian invasion or mission to liberate merchants on the central Anatolian plateau. But nevertheless, all of this underscores what is undoubtedly, unambiguously real relationships between the two regions. So I set out writing that 2015 book in a sense wary of this overwhelming text-based approach to the early Bronze Age. I guess what would be described as these very kind of literal proto-histories, where the questions that are being asked of the archaeology of the early Bronze Age seem to be determined to some extent by the text, textual traditions and even languages of the second millennium. So what I want to do, and what I started to do in the book, and what I want to do today, is to rethink the relationship ultimately between the early Bronze Age and the second millennium BCE. And of course, the textual traditions and even the languages will be in the background. But I want to introduce other kinds of archaeological data sets and sort of alternative ways to think about the archaeology of the early Bronze Age and its relationship with the second millennium and the late Bronze Age ultimately. And I describe it here as a kind of multi-scale or longue durée approach. Longue durée basically where landscapes are really becoming a sort of a primary actor, let's say, in understanding this relationship between the early Bronze Age and the second millennium. So you can see from the slide at the very top, I've got the largest scale. That's a map produced by my colleague Michele Massa. I'll be returning to that. And at the bottom, the very smallest scale, i.e. Very specific kinds of archaeological assemblages. And I want to sort of connect the dots and see what the relationship is between these different scales of archaeological analysis. So the largest scale is one where that encapsulates the whole of the Anatolian Peninsula, of course, and these three interaction zones. One from my book on the left, we see Michele's map in the middle, and a map by Claudia Glatz showing the distribution of Hittite Luvian rock monuments. And what I think the map that is most compelling here really is Mr. Michele's, because it shows in black and white. Black, where you would see the most friction in communication between different regions, i.e. the blacker the landscape, the more difficult it is to communicate, to travel through. And the lighter the landscape, of course, these are the routes of communication. And so what we can do with the three maps, mine on the left and then Claudia's on the right and Michele's in the middle, is we could see a very meaningful landscape mediated relationship between the three, where you have this kind of pure polity happening on the far left, the rock monuments on the far right, and in the middle, this sort of, in a way, it's almost the materialization of this landscape as a landscape of interaction. So this is the largest scale analysis and will always be in the kind of background of this presentation. So we come down a scale and we now are thinking about regions. In regions, mostly I would say defined by alluvial basins surrounded by higher elevation, more marginal landscapes. So from the book, from the 2015 book, I focused on Troy. There was a lot of Troy in the book. Obviously, there's a lot of data coming out of Troy and the Troy generally. And I began to reconstruct what I didn't frame it like this in the book, but I'm seeing it more and more as a kind of political landscape, where we see patterns emerging that have very real implications, I think, for emergent political structures in the early Bronze Age. And here, the most, I guess, the most important data on this slide is where we look at early Bronze 3 Troy, which is the wonderful painting in the middle, artist reconstruction, of course, a very controversial reconstruction, but reconstruction nonetheless. Obviously, we see the fortifications of the citadel, but on the map, what I'm showing here is the abandonment of all the EB1 to 2 sites in the Troad except for one, which is of course Troy. And this is a pattern that we see all over Anatolia, where people are recording this information. There is a real drop in settlement numbers and settlement frequency in the transition between EB1 to 2. We'll say that this is roughly about 2600 to 2500, and EB3. So how do we make sense of that settlement pattern? So I'm going to turn now to CRAS, for the Konya Regional Archaeological Survey Project, and some preliminary results that which we published in the Anatolian Studies in 2020, and I want to sort of think about and introduce data that hasn't actually appeared in other regional studies about the emergence of a political landscape in the early Bronze Age. So again, much of this has been published in the 2020 Anatolian Studies article, and I'll just focus now on the third millennium early Bronze Age part of our survey. So as everywhere else, I would say, in central and southern Anatolia, you have in the EB1 to 2 period an unprecedented crowding of settlement in these alluvial basins all over central and western Anatolia. In most regions, there are probably more settlements during the EB1 to 2 period than in any other period in prehistory or even early history. And probably it's not even until modern farming and industrial farming communities have begun to crop up in the latter half of the 20th century that you see anything like the settlement density. Certainly for the Konya Plain, I can't speak for other regions, but for the Konya Plain, this is the case. So there is a dramatic, a really astonishing settlement pattern in the Konya Plain, and it's something that James Mellart in his surveys had already picked up on. I'm very pleased that we were able to confirm these observations again and again in the field. But there is a really dramatic destruction horizon, EB2, so we'll say 2700, maybe around that 2600, across the region. And the map on the right, and with all the destructions, and that is the number of destructions we've recorded, and others, including of course, James Mellart, and Doug Baird, who's in the audience. Also, this is just a real trend that we have confirmed. And we've confirmed it also with some radiocarbon dates that we've taken from Ludger's trenches and some cuts. You can see there's an example here of a road cut where we have the stratigraphy of an EB2 destruction. That's actually my arm as scale. So this is real. James Mellart observed it first. Of course, he interpreted it as a kind of invasion. You can see it in the map on the upper right. We don't see it like that. We don't see Indo-European invasion in the way he did. But clearly something significant is happening. And it is violent. It is really, in every sense, an upheaval in the Konya Plain. Though, if we go back to the so destructions. If we come back to Troy and the Troad again, so the violent destructions aren't. We don't see that as much in the literature, but there is a similar pattern, where even if all of these smaller, the EB1 to 2 sites weren't violently destroyed, they were abandoned. And here we have destruction and abandonment of those sites you see represented on the map on the right. Okay, so if not an Indo-European or alluvian invasion, then what is going on? Before trying to address the question again. And in the Konya region, we are dealing with survey data. There is, of course, there's some excavated data from Konya Karahıyık, very patchy, very little to work with from stratified excavations. But nevertheless, there are some really interesting settlement patterns with which I think we can say quite a bit what is happening here. So the map at the left is most of this work. So this is beyond our survey area, the CRAS survey area. This was Hasan Bahar surveys in the 90s and the noughties, where he went up into the sort of uplands, into the marginal landscapes. And like we've been doing, like CRASP in our survey area, which is further east, we've been recording these fortified hilltop sites. And both Bahar surveys and our surveys, we're getting early Bronze Age assemblages in these fortified hilltop sites. I mean, architecturally, these hilltop sites are later. I mean, there were certainly none of them are architecturally early Bronze Age. But what the prevailing pattern is basically mostly Iron Age, architecturally Iron Age hilltop forts that appear to have been used for very long periods of time, because we're collecting early Bronze Age right through Iron Age and even Hellenistic material from the same forts. So what is really interesting in the Konya region is that chronologically, the fortified hilltops appear in the early Bronze Age only in the western region of the plain. We don't see them in sort of further east as we get into the CRAS survey area. And so there seems to be some kind of origin point here for fortifying landscapes. We don't see fortified hilltop sites before the early Bronze Age. So why here? Why just in the west? Why not further east, etc.? And there's another pattern. This is something that Michele had picked up on the right. And this is quite hypothetical. Of course, we're not, this is by no means a conclusive reconstruction of an irrigated landscape. But what Michele did is he saw from the yellow triangles this really almost unnaturally linear settlement pattern of early Bronze Age sites moving along a modern irrigation canal. And so what likely, these and we can see, if we go further east, we can see with the dotted lines, these other irrigation canals and sites following later sites, right? These would be, second millennium or even later Iron Age sites, following these modern irrigation canals up north into the Konya Plain, away from, of course, the Çarşamba alluvium. And so we're playing with the idea, and this is by no means conclusive, that we're potentially seeing some kind of irrigation intervention with those yellow triangles in the early Bronze Age, not far indeed from Konya Karahıyık. And if you go back to the map on the left, we see also a network of hilltop forts sort of encircling Konya Karahıyık. Okay, so what is happening here? I mean, this is certainly where we are on, sort of firmer ground with the network of fortifications. I think we are dealing with something very unprecedented, and I've described it here as sort of perceptions and conceptions of territorial landscapes. I believe we are looking at, again, some kind of emergent political landscape, for lack of a better term, and certainly some unprecedented kind of perception of a landscape as a territory, right? Not in any kind of bounded sense, right? But more along the lines of pinch points at these different routes of communication into the Konya Plain. You can see that how the hilltops correspond with these sort of alluvial systems that come in, that ultimately drain into the Çarşamba alluvium. That we're dealing here not with some bounded, like, sort of national entity, but these pinch points surrounding maybe, perhaps, Konya Karahıyık in the early Bronze Age. Again, very hypothetical. We don't know a lot about Konya Karahıyık, but we certainly know by the Middle Bronze Age that it was a palatial site. Okay, so an emergent political landscape, if we can call it that. And the point too here is that it has an origin point in the early Bronze Age, and we can see from the maps on the left, they sort of chronologically arranged that that these hilltop forts, which appeared confined to the eastern regions of the plain in the early Bronze Age, go to encircle the plain by the late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age. So here is an emergent political landscape that becomes more and more so, at least it becomes sort of more defined, let's say, as a political entity, i.e. the Konya plain becomes more defined as a political entity into the second millennium, and certainly by the late Bronze Age. Okay, so there are some implications I want to explore here, and these are issues that I did raise in my book, and what we need to do, of course, is we see all of these destructions and abandonments on the map, and we can sort of reconstruct in a very abstract way something quite unprecedented and volatile in these landscapes. But every one of these sites, of course, was a village that was destroyed and abandoned, violently destroyed and abandoned. And as part of the emergence of this political landscape, and so what I wanted to do with the book, and certainly what I want to do here, is to reconstruct as much as possible the life living in these villages. What was it like to live in these villages prior to this massive disruptive event? And a large part of this, the archaeology of the sites, of course, are the cemeteries. And indeed, I devoted an entire chapter in the book to early Bronze Age cemeteries. And crucially, there is a relationship, of course, between the abandonment of the villages and the abandonment of the cemeteries. I mean, they would have been abandoned together. And I want to, so this is some data. This is Latif Oksuz, who's doing a PhD in Durham currently, where he has quantified very nicely the sort of frequencies of burials in the Bronze Age, from the early Bronze Age to the late Bronze Age, broadly across every region in Turkey. And if we look at the graph on the right, you'll see the blue is the frequency of early Bronze Age burials, and the one outlier in this, interestingly, is central Anatolia, because of course in the Middle Bronze Age you have all of the kind of Assyrian sorts of intramural burials from the various cities in the Anatolian Plateau, skewing the data somewhat here. I mean, I think what to me is interesting is where most of these burials, the blue burials, right, the early Bronze Age burials, are from extramural cemeteries. And what we see, I think, from the third millennium into the second millennium, we see, of course, a decreasing frequency of settlements and a decreasing frequency of cemeteries in those settlements. And I think this is also is playing out in this data to some extent as well. And it's just, again, a way of thinking about and sort of teasing out this data a little bit. Why do we see so many more burials and cemeteries in the early Bronze Age than we do in the second millennium? This, of course, corresponds very closely with, I would say, a widespread abandonment of villages broadly in the early Bronze Age going into the second millennium, right? So that nucleation trend is also reflecting somewhat in the data here, in the mortuary data. Again, if we think, well, I mean, Latif here has it as burials, but we think most of these burials are from extramural cemeteries. That there's a real trend in reducing number of settlements and also extramural cemeteries, basically, in these landscapes in the transition from the third millennium to the second millennium. And of course, what I'd like to do and think about would be some of the perhaps social and ideological implications of that. Why we see fewer and fewer. Of course, we see fewer settlements. But surely we can also say something meaningful about the decreasing frequency of extramural cemeteries broadly as a kind of historical claims on landscapes, right? There's a shift now going into the second millennium where, of course, we see more intramural burials, but also interestingly, cremation, and thinking about potentially some of the implications of cremation in the second millennium as well. But anyway, that's somewhat of an aside. I want to come back to the what I try to do in the book here is really try to represent, and this isn't just one EB 1 to 2 village, but a kind of amalgam of different villages that I sort of abstracted into these diagrams. Of course, that's Demir Cihuk in the middle. But on the left and on the right, what I wanted to show is try to represent these villages as autonomous entities, as autonomous social or even ideological, economic, certainly, entities that really had a life of their own. There is no real dependency and there's no real asymmetrical relationship. I would say there's a great deal of autonomy happening here. And I would say with these trends, the trends of abandonment and destruction that define EB2 to EB3, that we're seeing now a decline of this, right? It's sort of, this is almost becoming a thing of the past as these emergent political landscapes begin to form in various regions in Anatolia, that this autonomous village is simply no longer a thing. Now there are villages, certainly, and there will be smaller scale settlements, certainly, but the degree of autonomy, I would argue, is probably very different, certainly by the second millennium, than compared to the villages I'm representing on the slide here. So some other implications, and so this is a recent publication by Stephanie Solova, and I like this a lot because, so she's, you know, there's a lot of focus, of course, on weaponry and you know, this sort of burial assemblages, the spectacular burial assemblages from central Anatolia that do, of course, include a lot of weapons. And what I like about this article is she's not approaching weapons like as somehow a proxy for social structure and some kind of chiefdom entity and, you know, power, and, you know, she's really getting at what I think is trying to get at the experience of living during this time period. And the way she did this was by looking at how many burials are in fact interred with female graves as opposed to male graves. And there's a striking frequency of weapons in female gendered burials. And so it's not that she's not arguing for some kind of you know, warrior class or some sort of Amazon, this or that. I mean, she's just getting at what is a profound sense of instability in a climate of violence, that it is a very unstable, violent period to live in. And that these weapons interred in female gendered burials offer us a glimpse of that very instability. And that threat of violence that was really almost the day-to-day. It was just part of living during this time period. Okay, so I want to think about other kinds of assemblages. Now, again, we're, you know, taking the scale down, we're reducing it down. Now, I mean, clearly, I've already begun with this sort of formulation of kind of a political landscapes emerging in the early Bronze Age. And this, you know, this, of course, what I'll be presenting here resonates very closely with the kind of state formation, for lack of a better term, approach to the archaeology of the early Bronze Age. And most of these assemblages, and if we look at the weight metrology on the right, or the ceilings in the middle, much of this literature has been sort of defined and dominated not so much by, you know, not so much by states or the emergence of some sort of new kind of political entity, but most of the literature focuses on exchange. Of course, if we look at, you know, weight metrology, or if we look at the ceilings, these are technologies with Mesopotamian origins, and overwhelmingly the literature has focused on that dimension of it, that there is this diffusionary innovation happening, but not really getting at the implications for it, the local implications for it. And that's, of course, something else I tried to do in my book, was to really localize these developments. Yes, there are diffusionary innovations, but what is happening locally? What are the local implications for taking on these what are ultimately Mesopotamian technologies, whether cylinder sealing or weight metrology? I'll come back to this question as we review some, again, more recent data. This is a recent PhD by Tom Malthus. I think I saw Tom in the audience, at least your name. And so this was a work that Tom had done in Liman Tepe and Bakla Tepe and with the Vasif and others in that region. And so as part of the AgriCurve project in Oxford, the agricultural origins of urban civilization, I think that's what it is. He was taking sort of archaeobotanical studies of from early Bronze Age contexts. I mentioned Bakla Tepe and of course Liman Tepe, and what he showed. And again, we have to sort of take a big picture here. So if we start from the Neolithic. Neolithic farming practices are, generally characterized as sort of almost like garden farming, very sort of intensive, a lot of manuring, a lot of water, right? Just a very sort of intensive practice. Again, more garden than field. And what Tom was able to show through sort of chronologically, also even from the late Chalcolithic, is that the farming practices evolved from this sort of garden type, high input, intensive, to a lower input extensive strategy, where again we're dealing now with sort of fields and fields that are being left fallow, this sort of thing. Sort of, I guess, almost a more modern kind of farming practice. And he showed this, I think, very convincingly and chronologically indeed. Going into the early Bronze Age, where you have these extensive practices at play. He was looking at sort of weed taxa, and of course here we're showing sort of nitrogen isotope values, all pointing at low input, extensive, so again, field-oriented farming practices. But crucially, it wasn't a trigger necessarily for the EB3 phenomenon, right? It wasn't that all of a sudden you have these extensive practices, which of course can yield greater surpluses, et cetera, it didn't immediately jump, it didn't say it wasn't a catalyst to an immediate state formation process or a consolidation. But what he's argued, and I'm actually very convinced by this, is that originally in the early EB1 to 2, yes, you have more potential for surplus with these extensive practices, but these are being managed collectively. If we look at at the representation of Demirci-Hüyük, you've got those sort of grain storage areas in the middle of that, in that kind of a common socially integrative area of the settlement. So yes, you have greater productive capacity, you've got more potential certainly for surplus, but that surplus was being managed and consumed, and indeed consumed more collectively. Whereas in EB3, and again, I'm using his terminology here, you have a productive inequality emerging, where certain households began to, in a sense, consolidate their productive capacities and began to draw on the labor and resources of other households, et cetera, leading to what we see on the right is one elite household on a citadel, for example, essentially consolidating all of that farming productivity, and here materially manifest in the large pithos jars you see from Schlieman's excavations on the right. Right, so extensive farming practices leading ultimately to productive inequality by the EB3 period. Less, let's just say, it's maybe less archaeologically accessible, but I think there's probably a similar process happening here in textile industries, where we can look at, for example, at Troy again, a huge increase in the numbers and frequencies of spinner whorls and loom weights in Troy 2 to 3 compared to Troy 1. And here we can also begin to think about extensification in terms of herd management strategies, perhaps, and this is something I argued in the book, where one reason why you have an abandonment of a lot of these places in the EB1 to 2 period is because they started becoming productive, agriculturally productive, or even productive for animal husbandry for the Troy citadel. So as Troy's productive capacity increases in these various industries, we see also the abandonment of a lot of the places where, for example, you could grow crops or you could graze animals, etc. So a similar kind of extensification, very much a spatial phenomenon here potentially in the management of animals moving out from Troy across the grazing landscapes of the Troad. So here is one of my favorite assemblages of objects, really, and that is the instruments of weight metrology, pan balance weights here specifically, and you can see also the image, the drawing of a balance arm. All of these, again, from Troy contexts. And again, I made the point earlier, but it's worth emphasizing that so much of the literature on this really just focuses on the exchange elements of this. And of course, these are instruments of exchange. You would have used them in context of exchange, but always it seems like its greatest significance in previous literature is that they somehow inform these long distance exchange networks. Certainly they existed. We've seen a lot of evidence for that already. And of course, inform this diffusionary relationship between a Mesopotamian technology, i.e. weight metrology, no doubt, is of Mesopotamian origin, and what we see across Anatolia in the early Bronze Age. And in my book, I wanted to move this thinking away from that, and that's certainly relevant and is certainly meaningful and interesting, but that there's this whole new conception now of materials, of commodities, of administration, of bureaucracy. This is an essential element of what is, I think, a state formation process, right? I mean, certainly accountancy, et cetera, and if we look at the Mesopotamian context, is more closely associated with administration than it is exchange, right? I mean, it originated in an administrative context and not so much a merchant context, right? And so I try to shift the thinking a little bit to, okay, let's think about these emergent entities on citadels and the technologies of control that they're using on these citadels. And weight metrology is indeed one of these instruments that I think have really significant administrative implications, alongside, of course, all the diffusionary implications of the transmission of this technology. Okay, so I'll just sort of sum up now the big patterns for the early Bronze Age. Why here? Why now? I mean, there's no doubt, again, that there is a diffusionary thing happening that is real, that is meaningful. It is no question having some influence on what is going on here. My only gripe is that that's where all the literature tends to be. And again, the problem is that it's not that archaeologists are not asking questions of the local scene, of the local kind of emergence phenomenon, when so much of the literature is about this sort of the ex orient lux diffusion of these technologies. Yes, they are diffusionary innovations, but they also have very real implications for the emergence of what I understand to be proto-state entities on these citadels. And again, if you think about it locally, we can begin then extrapolate from these kinds of data sets and think about how these people living on citadels are accumulating wealth, right? Whether it's metallurgical wealth or the agricultural wealth, and what they're doing with it, what they're investing it in, right? We can, once we get away from the kind of the diffusionary question, we can really start asking some, I think, compelling questions about how this wealth is being used and for what, right? And here, very neatly, we can sort of distinguish the sort of staple finance accumulations of wealth from the wealth finance accumulations of wealth, and begin thinking about how and why and with what consequences this wealth is being invested by the people who live on these citadels. Yeah, and again, coming back to this living with violence, really trying to humanize, in a sense, what is happening here. Yes, we can see abandonment and destruction all over the place. But you know, and perhaps I don't think I did this enough in my book, and I would, you know, certainly would like to return to this this notion of just living in a period of upheaval like this, with that threat of violence, the omnipresent threat of violence, and there's just destruction and the sort of overturning and upheaval of what I would say would be previous lifestyles in a sense. Seemingly, all of that has come to a pretty destructive end by the middle of the third millennium. So it is not just the violence and the destruction of these villages, abandoning these villages, but also introducing what I would say is likely a new era of potential for conflict between emergent entities, state-like entities even in this period. Here, you know, thinking about that relationship between the kind of economic extensification that I talked about earlier, and the territorialization of the emergent political landscape in the early Bronze Age. Okay, all right. So this is supposed to be the point of my talk. What is that? So I've sort of summed up the early Bronze Age, and certainly from my book. What then is the relationship with the late Bronze Age? And the most obvious answer, it would be, well, there's a much more direct relationship between the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age. And here, of course, now the excavations at Kültepe are showing this beautifully, where really, you know, if we look at the level 13 citadel, you know, now beautifully revealed on the left, and we think about the palace of level 7, the Warshama Palace, level 7 on the right, I mean, there's really no qualitative difference between these two entities. Certainly on the citadel itself, right? It is certainly the scale. Okay, there might be a larger scale, but the difference really is a scalar difference rather than any qualitative difference between what is happening at Kültepe in the Middle Bronze Age and the Early Bronze Age. And if we zoom out and we think about settlement patterns from the Early Bronze Age to the Middle Bronze Age, here again a lot of continuity. You know, sites that are demonstrably, you know, emergent centers in the Early Bronze Age can host palaces during the Middle Bronze Age across the Central Anatolian Plateau. You know, there is, I think, some merit in describing this, what I've just, you know, used maybe somewhat flippantly as the long third millennium, that there is really no real qualitative difference between the Middle Bronze Age and the latter half of the third millennium. You know, and that one difference, of course, has to do with that what might be an anomaly of foreign merchants who happen to keep archives. But beyond that, there is a great deal of continuity. So we move then into the late Bronze Age, and then here we can describe a sort of rupture in one sense, right? There is something really quite unprecedented here in the late Bronze Age, something that had not been experienced before in Central and Western Anatolia, and of course that is an empire. You know, the emergence of a kind of imperial entity, and here again, on the left, and this is coming out of Michele's PhD, where again very, very nicely illustrates the sort of friction or lack thereof of communication in the early Bronze Age. And we look at these routes of communication in the early Bronze Age, and we can map them on quite nicely with some of the imperial interactions, for example, that Claudia Glatz has so neatly illustrated in her articles and in her recent 2020 monograph. So on the one hand, yes, a political rupture, but on the other hand, well, the landscapes are the same, of course, and we are still dealing with networks of interaction. So it's well known, of course, that in the Central Anatolian Plateau, most of those Middle Bronze Age, all the Middle Bronze Age palaces were violently destroyed and abandoned to make room ultimately for this emergent late Bronze Age policy in the Land of Hatti at Hattusa. Right, so there is a real rupture there in terms of settlement patterns. But what is happening elsewhere? And of course, now I'll turn back to the region that I know best, and that is the Konya region. And And here again, there is what appears to be a meaningful transition from the early Bronze, or the long third millennium, the early Bronze Age, middle Bronze Age continuum, to the late Bronze Age. And what we see, I think, quite dramatically is, like the Middle Bronze Age palaces on the central Anatolian plateau, the palace at Konya was violently destroyed and abandoned. And there appears to be a shift to the east, where following the destruction and abandonment of Konya, which we argue was likely, if not the primary center of the Konya Plain in the early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age, then certainly the eastern region of the Konya Plain, western region of the Konya Plain, there is a shift to Turkmen-Karahiyik, which has been a primary focus of both CRASP and the Turkmen-Karahiyik Intensive Survey Project since 2019. And Turkmen-Karahiyik is, by any definition, an urban site. I mean, by factor of 3, it is larger than any other Bronze Age site in the Konya Plain. We can compare, for example, Konya-Karahiyik, maybe maximum 40 hectares, 45 hectares. Turkmen-Karahiyik in the late Bronze Age, 120 possibly hectares. These are results from the Turkmen-Karahiyik Intensive Survey Project. So there is a kind of a rupture as well on the Konya Plain, that shift from Konya-Karahiyik as a center to Turkmen-Karahiyik. The scale is really astonishing of the site, but also there is the hieroglyphic Luwian inscription, Iron Age King Hartapu. The size of the site, the Iron Age sort of inscription, royal inscription of King Hartapu, is supported a hypothesis that perhaps we are dealing with possibly a major late Bronze Age center at Turkmen-Karahiyik, and we've raised the possibility that we are indeed looking at possibly Tarantasha, the Appanage kingdom that, of course, was the capital of the Hittite Empire for a brief time under the reign of Muwatalli II, and then becomes a rival of Hatti subsequently. But of course, that's an excavation will solve that or not. Okay, so what does this all mean? So I'm taking what is ultimately a longue durée perspective on this problem. If we think about the Konya Plain in particular, what we see is from the early Bronze Age into the late Bronze Age, we see an emergent political landscape forming, most poignantly with the fortification networks that sort of encircle the site, right? So we have what is ultimately a fracturing landscape to some extent across Anatolia from the early Bronze Age to the late Bronze Age. This is something that regional surveys should always be looking out for, these sort of fortified hilltops in these various regions. So on the one hand, yes, we can talk about interaction, we can talk about a kind of pure polity, et cetera, but we're also dealing with what I see as a very fractured political landscape emerging across central and western Anatolia in the early Bronze Age and middle Bronze Age. And it is indeed this fractured political landscape that the Hittite imperial project encounters in its expansions in the late Bronze Age. And we can really, sort of map on the one hand the interactions, what is clearly a kind of interaction zone, whether in the early Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age, with what is ultimately a kind of the political landscapes of this region, which is indeed quite fractured, and even under, of course, Hittite imperial expansion, remains a fiercely contested landscape. Okay, thank you very much.